Cedar Creek Medical's night shift hums with fluorescent lights and the antiseptic tang of bleach on linoleum. 2:47 a.m. The ICU breathes with the steady rhythm of 100 machines, each beep a heartbeat borrowed from science. Katie Rodriguez moves through the corridors in pale blue scrubs, her dark hair pulled back in a bun so tight it pulls her temples, checking monitors with barely a sound. The other nurses chat at the central station, their voices rising and falling like birds in a cage, but Katie works alone, her movements economical and precise. She doesn't walk through rooms. She glides through them, the way someone moves when they've learned to make themselves smaller than their presence demands. Her hands move from patient to patient, adjusting a ventilator tube, reading a pulse, marking vitals on a chart with handwriting so neat it could be printed, and nobody notices that her eyes never stop moving. She has sight lines to every door, every exit, every angle of approach. In her locker in the staff room downstairs, buried beneath a spare uniform and a thermos of cold coffee, sits a folded flag in a plastic case. The flag is old. The plastic has yellowed like old ivory, and the edges have worn soft from being carried in a duffel bag for 15 years, handled in darkness, pressed against ribs during long flights home. 17 soldiers came back from Ramadi because of what happened on a night that no one remembers, because it never officially happened, because some operations live in redacted files and whispered call signs and the dreams of the people who were there. That flag came home in someone else's hands. Katie carries it anyway. A thin scar runs from her left wrist to her elbow, white and smooth against olive skin, visible when she reaches for supplies, invisible when her hands rest at her sides. The other nurses have never asked about it. They don't ask about the small silver pin she keeps in her scrub pocket, or the way she wakes up when people approach from behind, or the fact that she can clear a room full of machines just by moving through it like she's checking a perimeter. They think she's just quiet, competent, a little distant. They think she's just a nurse. Room 312 holds a new patient. Transfer from Walter Reed, 2 days post-op, Army Ranger captain with a gunshot wound to the chest, ribs fractured, lungs compressed, stable but requiring hourly monitoring through the night. Katie pulled the chart 40 minutes ago when the ambulance alert came through. She read the name. James Chen. 5th Battalion, Ranger Company Bravo. The unit designation at the bottom of the page made her hands go very still for exactly 3 seconds. She'd been in that unit. She'd been in forward operating bases where that call sign was whispered with the kind of respect that gets people killed if they say it too loud. Captain Chen brought her son home from Ramadi alive. The boy came home in a flag, but Chen came home with 17 other soldiers because of what happened on a night nobody talks about. She finished her vital signs check on room 311, then moved to 312 without changing her pace, without showing anything on her face. The door was open. The room was dark except for the ambient glow of monitors. Captain Chen was asleep, his chest wrapped in gauze, his breathing shallow and medicated. She checked his oxygen saturation, 92%, good, stable. She checked his heart rate, his blood pressure, the clear fluid running through the fall line in his arm. She made notes on his chart in her precise handwriting. Time, vitals, observations. Just a nurse doing night rounds. Just a woman in scrubs checking machines. That was all. But her jaw had clenched. Once. Briefly. Her hands had moved with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory, from doing this in dust storms under enemy fire, from understanding that hesitation kills people. And she had stayed in that room for exactly 90 seconds longer than necessary, standing in the corner with sight lines to the door and the window, watching the rise and fall of his chest, making sure he was real, making sure the boy who wore his insignia had actually come home. Now, for hours later, the ICU is quieter. The night deepens. Nurses move through the corridors like ghosts, speaking in whispers, their footsteps soft on linoleum that smells of industrial cleaner and something underneath it, something like rust and old blood that won't quite wash away. Katie moves through the dimmed hallway reviewing a chart, her pen making small marks next to billing codes. Duplicate charge for cardiac monitoring supplies. Phantom procedure code that shouldn't be there. A supply vendor that doesn't exist in the system. She marks each one with a small, careful note. She doesn't comment on them. She doesn't report them. Not yet. Not to anyone who would bury it. The chart is Dr. Mercer's patient from room 408. The one who came in 3 days ago with a simple arterial bleed, needed a simple procedure, was supposed to leave yesterday. Instead, the bill shows 14 separate charges for equipment that never should have been ordered. Katie has seen this pattern before. Twice in 6 months. Both times under Dr. Mercer's name. Both times the vendor, Mitchell Medical Solutions, doesn't exist until you dig deeper. Both times the paper trail goes quiet. She's closing the chart when his footsteps appear behind her. Click. 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 Expensive shoes on tile, the leather kind that cost more than she makes in a month. Dr. Mercer. 5'11", salt and pepper hair, the kind of face that looks expensive, like all his features were purchased from somewhere upscale and assembled by someone with good taste. He's dressed in a charcoal suit at 2:50 a.m., which means he's either been here since the afternoon or never went home. His eyes are the color of a parking garage floor, gray, cold, with the kind of intelligence that calculates everything in terms of value and leverage. He stops beside her at the nurse's station. He doesn't speak. He just looks at what she's looking at. The chart. Her notes. Her pen suspended over the billing codes. Thorough tonight, he says. His voice is low, soft, the kind of quiet that makes you listen harder. Just reviewing, Katie says. Her voice doesn't change. Neutral. Professional. Deferential. The voice she wears like a uniform. That chart is mine to review, he says. Not a request. Information delivered like a statement of fact. Katie closes the chart. Slides it across the desk toward him. Just checking the overnight entries. His hand comes down and catches the chart before she can pull her hand back completely. Not fast. Not aggressive. Just inevitable, like a snake striking. His fingers brush against hers and his eyes are on her face, watching for something, a flinch, a flutter, a moment of hesitation. Katie doesn't move. She doesn't pull her hand away. She just lets him take the chart, her eyes steady on the monitor screens in front of her, her breathing unchanged. You're very thorough with details, he says. It doesn't sound like a compliment. It sounds like an observation about a problem he's still deciding what to do about. It's part of the job, Katie says. Yes, he says. It is. But some details aren't meant for nursing staff to notice. Katie turns to look at him then. Her eyes meet his for exactly 1 second. Cold. Clear. The kind of eyes that have looked at things that broke other people. The kind of eyes that don't show fear because fear is a luxury for people who have something left to lose. I'm just here to keep patients safe, she says. Dr. Mercer smiles. It's the kind of smile that looks pleasant on his face but doesn't reach his eyes. The kind of smile that makes the air pressure change, like a storm moving in. He sets the chart down on the desk between them with deliberate care. And I appreciate that, he says. Which is why I wanted to tell you personally. You're being reassigned, starting tomorrow night. You'll be covering the pediatric ward. Rotation change. Administration decision. Congratulations. Katie doesn't speak for a moment. The pediatric ward is the other side of the hospital. It's a different shift cycle. It's away from the ICU. Away from room 312. Away from whatever he doesn't want her to see. She nods once. Understood. Good, he says. He picks up the chart again and tucks it under his arm. You're a good nurse, Rodriguez. Really? It's important that we protect good people from getting too close to things that aren't their concern. You understand? It's not a question. It's a threat delivered in the tone of advice, wrapped in the language of protection. Katie recognizes the language. She's heard it in briefing rooms in compounds that don't exist. Heard it from men who smile while they're explaining how to make problems disappear. I understand, she says. Good, he says again. He walks away, his expensive shoes clicking down the hallway, each step an echo, each echo a warning. The ICU goes quiet again except for the machines. Beeping. Whirring. The sound of people staying alive in the dark. Katie doesn't move for 30 seconds. She just sits very still at the station, her hands folded on the desk in front of her, her eyes on the monitors. On the vital signs coming from the rooms around her. On the oxygen saturation number from room 312 climbing steadily on the screen. 94%. Stable. Good. The captain is breathing fine. The night stretches on. Katie finishes her charts. She checks on her other patients, the woman in 306 with pneumonia, the man in 309 recovering from bypass surgery, the elderly patient in 314 who wakes up sometimes and calls for his daughter. She does the work quietly. She does it well. And every hour on the hour, she walks to room 312 and checks on Captain Chen. Heart rate. Blood pressure. Oxygen saturation. Chest rise. The small things that tell you a person is still alive. The measurements that matter. At 5 a.m., as the sky outside the window starts to lighten from black to dark blue, something interesting happens. Captain Chen wakes up. His eyes open. His breathing changes. For a moment he looks confused, the way people look when they wake up in a place that isn't home and their body is full of pain. Katie is there in 30 seconds. She doesn't know how she moved so fast. She was at the medication station. Now she's beside his bed. You're in Cedar Creek Medical, she says. Her voice is steady. Calm. The voice of someone who has explained this before. Denver. You're stable. You're going to be okay. He focuses on her. His eyes are brown, sharp, intelligent. They search her face for a second, and then something shifts behind them. Recognition, maybe. Or just the memory of what a captain looks like when she's standing in a hospital room looking at you like she knows everything about you and is choosing not to say it. How long? His voice is rough. Medicated. Lower than hers. 2 days. You're doing fine, she says. She adjusts his full line with practiced hands. Try to rest. I'll be back in an hour. She doesn't say her name. She doesn't introduce herself. She just turns and walks back out of the room, and behind her she hears him exhale, and she doesn't know if it's relief or something else, and she doesn't allow herself to think about it. That's the job. That's always been the job. Help, don't break. Serve, don't show. Know everything, tell nothing. But as she walks back down the hallway toward the nurse's station, her hand comes up absently to her scrub pocket. Her fingers brush against the silver pin there. The one she keeps close. The one she carries like a secret and a memorial and a promise she made to people who don't remember how to keep theirs anymore. The ICU hums around her. The machines beep. The morning starts to arrive. And somewhere in the hospital, Dr. Mercer sleeps in a cool room or goes home to a house full of things he bought with money that doesn't belong to him, never knowing that the one person he tried to move out of his way just spent 2 hours looking at the man she died trying to save. What he didn't know was that Katie Rodriguez wasn't just thorough with details. She was thorough with everything. And the details she'd seen in his billing codes, the pattern that repeated every month like clockwork, the pattern that connected to a vendor that didn't exist and a doctor who'd learned how to steal from hospitals the way other men learned how to tie their shoes, those details had gone into the same compartment of her mind where she kept everything else. Organized. Filed. Waiting. Room for Ofer didn't have a knock to announce him. Dr. Mercer simply entered at 06 for 5, his pressed white coat catching the morning light, and Katie's hands remained steady on the medication cart even though she heard him before she saw him. The elderly patient in the bed, Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, 83 years old, recovering from a fractured hip, looked toward the sound of his voice before he'd even opened his mouth. That was the thing about Dr. Mercer. He filled rooms the way oil fills water. There was no mixing, no peace. Just displacement. "Miss Rodriguez," he said, loud enough that the nurses passing in the hallway could hear it, loud enough that Mrs. Hayes's daughter, Sarah, straightened in her chair by the window. "Walk me through your medication protocol here." Katie capped the syringe with controlled precision, her movements clean and practiced. The foreport was already flushed, the line patent, the patient's arm positioned at the correct angle. Everything was textbook. Everything was right. That was precisely the problem. Lisinopril 10 milligrams as ordered, Doctor, Katie said, her voice pitched low and professional. Administered at 0620 hours. Blood pressure verified at 0615 prior to administration. Mercer picked up the chart like he was handling evidence in a courtroom, his fingers trailing down the page with exaggerated care. The silence stretched. Sarah Hayes leaned forward, her expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to concern. Old people could read the air in a room the way younger people read screens. They knew when power was being weaponized. "Interesting," Mercer said finally, drawing the word out like it contained paragraphs. "Because I'm seeing a notation here that suggests you failed to verify the patient's blood pressure before administration. Standard protocol, Miss Rodriguez. The kind of protocol most competent nurses find absolutely essential." He looked up from the chart, his eyes cutting toward Sarah Hayes before returning to Katie. The kind of protocol that separates caregivers from people who merely occupy space in scrubs. Katie's jaw tightened once. A single clench, barely visible, like a muscle remembering something it had learned a long time ago. She didn't defend herself. She didn't say that the blood pressure had been documented at 128/82, systolic and diastolic, each number recorded in her handwriting on the vital sheet clipped to the foot of the bed. She didn't say that Mercer's own standing orders required BP verification only for patients on antihypertensive medications where systolic exceeded 130. She didn't say any of these things because saying them would have required her to engage, and engagement was what he wanted. Engagement was surrender wearing a different face. Instead, she said, blood pressure was 128/82, Doctor. Documented at 0615. The vital sheet is in the chart. Mercer smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd learned long ago that truth was negotiable and perception was permanent. He turned a page in the chart, pretended to study it with the intensity of someone analyzing nuclear codes. The fluorescent light hummed above them, a sound like insects trapped behind plastic, trapped and exhausted and no longer struggling. Katie had stopped noticing that sound 3 years ago. Right now it was all she could hear. "And yet," Mercer said, "I don't see your initials on the blood pressure log. Sloppy work, scrubs." He closed the chart with a snap that made Sarah Hayes flinch. That's what happens when we hire people who think verifying details is beneath them. When protocol becomes optional based on whoever's holding the clipboard that day. The knuckles on Katie's right hand had gone white where she gripped the medication cart. The metal was cold. The metal was real. Everything else in the room had become abstract, the patient's fear, the daughter's shame on Mrs. Hayes's behalf, Mercer's calculation. Only the cart existed. Only the cold steel and the weight of her own hands. "We'll have a more experienced nurse verify everything going forward," Mercer said, already moving toward the door. "Can't be too careful with Mrs. Hayes. Can't be too careful when we're working with people who don't understand the fundamentals." He didn't wait for a response. He didn't require one. His words were self-contained, self-sufficient, needing no acknowledgement to achieve their purpose. After he left, Mrs. Hayes wouldn't look at Katie. Sarah Hayes smoothed the blanket across her mother's legs, a gesture that had nothing to do with warmth and everything to do with apology. Katie adjusted the flow rate, the infusion pump whispering its mechanical breath, and left the room without making eye contact either. The isolation was mutual and complete. The break room at 1400 hours was a small space with a refrigerator that hummed like it was dying slowly, a microwave with a stain on its interior that no amount of cleaning would remove, and 3 round tables that had been scarred by years of coffee cups and elbows and the small violences of exhaustion. When Katie entered with her lunch bag, 4 nurses were scattered across the tables. Margot from nights, who'd always been kind. Jessica from pediatrics, who'd covered Katie's shift once when Michael had gotten sick. 2 newer nurses whose names Katie had learned but didn't yet know beyond their work. The room smelled like antiseptic and whatever someone had microwaved yesterday, a phantom odor that clung. The conversation stopped when Katie set down her bag. It wasn't a dramatic cessation. It was subtle, professional, the kind of silence that had deniability built into it. One moment there had been voices, something about a medication order, someone's night shift running long, and then there was only the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a monitor alarming in someone's room down the hall. Katie opened her container of rice and vegetables and began to eat. Her movements were precise, mechanical. The fork rose, descended, rose again. Her jaw worked with the efficiency of someone performing a task. Margot was the first to move. She gathered her coffee cup with both hands like it was something fragile and needed protecting. Her chair scraped against the linoleum, a harsh, high sound that made even the other nurses wince. Jessica followed, her footsteps quiet on the tile, her eyes directed at the door rather than anywhere else. The 2 newer nurses exchanged a glance, and then they rose too, collecting their belongings with the synchronized precision of soldiers following orders that had been given without words. 5 chairs scraping. 5 departures. Each one its own small announcement. Katie continued eating. The rice was cold by now. The vegetables had the texture of things that had been separated from their source too long. She ate methodically, her expression locked in the kind of professional neutrality that nurses learned during their first shift when they realized that every emotion was a liability. Screaming silently was a skill like everything else. You got better with practice. At 1600 hours, Dr. Mercer posted the disciplinary notice on the unit board where the entire ICU staff passed throughout the shift. The paper was official, hospital letterhead, his signature in blue ink that looked like the signature of someone signing his own importance into existence. The notice read in black type, disciplinary action. Employee, K. Rodriguez. Date, current. Violations, insubordination. Failure to follow medication administration protocols. Inadequate documentation and chart completion. Status, probationary, effective immediately. Supervisor, Dr. Richard Mercer, M.D. No mention that the medication had been correct. No mention that the blood pressure had been documented. No mention that Mercer had witnessed the entire process and made no objection until he decided to stage a performance in front of a patient and her daughter. Just violation, probation, exposure. Just the kind of record that made other people keep their distance, that made future employers squint at the paperwork and ask questions that ended careers before they could really begin. Staff members slowed as they passed. Nurses who'd worked beside Katie for 3 years, who'd borrowed her stethoscope and asked her advice about difficult patients, who'd eaten lunch in the same break room for months. They read the notice the way soldiers read casualty lists, scanning for names, recognizing the significance, understanding immediately who was now untouchable. Katie continued restocking the supply cart at the far end of the hallway, her hands moving with methodical precision. Lisinopril in the A section. Metoprolol in the M section. Everything alphabetized, everything organized, everything where it belonged. She didn't look up when people passed. She didn't acknowledge the glances or the whispers that started and stopped like interrupted broadcasts. Her composure was perfect because perfect composure was the only thing left that Mercer couldn't take. At 1730 hours, after she'd finished her charting and documented every medication interaction and vital sign and assessment with the kind of precision that made her documentation look like federal records, Katie entered the supply closet. It was a small room on the north side of the unit, windowless, lined with shelves holding dressings and tape and the 1,000 small consumables that kept a hospital running. The door closed behind her with a soft pneumatic hiss. For 30 seconds, she counted them like they were currency. Katie stood with her hand pressed flat against the cold metal shelf. Her eyes closed. Her breathing regulated itself into something measured and controlled, the way breathing had to become when emotion threatened to become visible. The other things she could control, her face, her voice, her hands. The breathing was harder. The breathing wanted to become ragged. The breathing wanted to become tears, which was a form of drowning, and Katie had learned a long time ago that she didn't drown. She sank, sometimes. She went under, sometimes. But she didn't drown. When she opened her eyes again, the supply closet looked exactly as it had before, shelves and shadows and the smell of latex and sterilizing agent. She could hear the unit beyond the door. The ventilators. The monitors. The quiet crisis that was every hospital after dark. People healing. People failing. People hanging somewhere in between, waiting for a decision to come down. Katie returned to her charts. The paperwork was waiting. The patients were waiting. The night shift had hours left before she could leave, and there was nothing to be done except continue moving, continue working, continue being the person that no one could break, because breaking required engagement, and she had learned, in sand and blood and 3,000 miles from home, that survival meant having nothing left that could be threatened. But that wasn't the worst part. The night shift had hours left before she could leave, and there was nothing to be done except continue moving, continue working, continue being the person that no one could break, because breaking required engagement, and she had learned in sand and blood and 3,000 miles from home that survival meant having nothing left that could be threatened. At 2,100 hours, Katie Rodriguez stepped into room 312 with Captain James Chen's chart already open in her mind. The numbers were there, waiting for her to see them the way no one else would. Respiratory rate 16 on admission, documented at 1900. Now, as she approached the bed, the ventilator's wheeze told her something had shifted. She placed the pulse oximeter probe on his finger with steady hands and watched the monitor climb to life. 22 breaths per minute. The number sat there like a warning light no one else was watching. She stood at his bedside and observed his chest rise. The left side lifted clean and sharp. The right side was a half-second slower, subtly asymmetrical, the kind of detail that separates a competent nurse from someone who was just counting minutes until shift change. His oxygen saturation was 94%, drifting downward from the 97% she'd documented 2 hours before. Not critical. Not yet. But the trajectory was there, and trajectories told stories to anyone trained to read them. Katie had read trajectories before. She'd read them in the Jolin district, where a radiator leak could mean an IED was buried 6 meters from the convoy's path. She'd read them in the eyes of soldiers who'd taken shrapnel and insisted they were fine until they weren't. She'd read them in the vital signs of dying men, where the difference between a 4-minute window and a 3-minute window was the difference between recovery and permanent darkness. Captain Chen's trajectory was a downward slope, subtle but unmistakable. She reached for the phone at the nursing station and paged Dr. Mercer. Then she waited, her hands occupied with checking fluid balances and medication times, the 1,000 small tasks that filled the night. The page went unanswered. At 21:15, she paged again. The acknowledgement came back, in radiology. "We'll call." He called at 21:40, his voice already tight with irritation before she'd spoken a single word. "Rodriguez." "What is it?" "Captain Chen." His respiratory rates elevated to 24 as of my last check. Oxygen saturation drifting. Currently 94% on the same FiO2. Chest rise is asymmetrical, right side decreased. The silence on the other end lasted exactly 4 seconds. "His numbers are within acceptable range," Mercer said finally, his tone the tone of a man explaining basic mathematics to a slow child. "Stop wasting my time with nervous hovering, Rodriguez." She kept her voice level, kept it exactly where it belonged, under control, underwater, invisible. "His respiratory trend suggests possible complication. I recommend a chest X-ray to rule out pneumothorax recurrence. I recommend you remember who went to medical school." His voice had moved past irritation into something colder. Captain Chen is stable. You will document current vitals and you will leave clinical decisions to physicians. Are we clear? Clear, doctor. He hung up without answering. Katie stood holding the dead phone, the fluorescent lights humming above her like insects trapped in plastic. Her jaw clenched once, briefly. Just once. Then it released, and she was still again. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came when she checked Chen's chart 30 seconds later and found the note Mercer had already documented, Nurse Rodriguez demonstrating excessive anxiety regarding stable patient. No intervention warranted. Ongoing concern regarding boundary violations and clinical scope creep. The words sat there in the electronic record, cementing themselves into evidence. Each one was a nail. Together they built a coffin marked with her name. At 21:55, Katie heard 2 phone calls being made from Mercer's office. The first was to the ICU charge nurse, and even from the distance of 30 feet she caught the cadence of instruction, the tone that left no room for questions. The second call came 5 minutes later, this one to someone higher. She heard Mercer's voice shift into concerned colleague mode, the voice he used when he needed something from people with titles. We may have a liability issue with Rodriguez. Overstepping boundaries, questioning orders, making patients' families nervous. I think we need to document a pattern before it becomes a lawsuit. Pause. No, nothing overt. Just concerning judgment. I'd rather address it now. Katie didn't move. Movement would indicate that she'd heard, that she cared, that something in her had registered the impact. Instead she held herself exactly still, the way soldiers held themselves still when mortar rounds were still falling but you couldn't move without drawing fire. At 2300, she returned to Chen's room. His oxygen saturation had drifted to 92%. His respiratory rate was now 24, each breath slightly faster than the one before it, the ventilator working harder to keep pace with his body's rising demand. She adjusted his supplemental oxygen from 40 to 50%, watching the monitor climb back toward acceptable numbers. It rose to 94, then stuck there. Not improving. Just holding its ground. Chen's eyes opened partway. They were the eyes of a man who'd been trained to notice threats, and even drugged and post-operative, there was something in them that made him dangerous. "Nurse," he whispered, his voice rough as asphalt. "Your name?" Katie paused. 1 second. That's all it was. 1 second of hesitation before she answered, "Rodriguez, sir." Something shifted behind his eyes. Recognition. The kind of recognition that came from a small military community where names meant lineages and lineages meant everything. "Rodriguez," he repeated. "You have a son." "Michael Rodriguez." Rangers. The supply of air in Katie's chest suddenly felt finite. She kept her voice steady. "Yes, sir." "Good kid," Chen said, each word an effort. "Brave. Very brave." His breathing was labored now, each inhalation requiring visible effort. "You should be proud." Katie didn't answer. She couldn't. The folded flag in her locker, the one she'd carried for 15 years, the one made from the fuselage of a helicopter that came down in Ramadi in 2009, suddenly felt like it was pulling at her from 30 feet away, a gravity she couldn't escape. Chen's eyes closed again. His breathing continued its slow climb in frequency, each breath a small clock ticking toward something neither of them could stop. At 23:45, Katie documented his vitals, respiratory rate 26, oxygen saturation 89%, chest rise still asymmetrical, still favoring the left, still wrong in a way that only someone trained to see crisis in its earliest stages could recognize. She paged Dr. Mercer. No response. At 0012, she paged again. This time the response came through his office nurse. "Dr. Mercer is with another patient. Will call when available." At 0138, Katie paged a third time. The oxygen saturation was now 87%. Chen's respiratory rate had climbed to 28. His skin was beginning to take on the pale, drawn quality of someone whose oxygen supply was beginning to fail at the cellular level. Dr. Mercer called her directly this time. His voice was flat, all pretense of professionalism removed like a surgeon removing a mask. "If you page me one more time tonight for nothing, Rodriguez, you'll be looking for a new job by morning." "That's not a threat. That's a promise. He is stable. Stop calling me." The line disconnected. Katie stood at the nursing station with the phone growing warm in her hand, her mouth a straight line, her eyes fixed on the monitor in room 312 where Captain Chen's oxygen saturation continued its downward march toward the point of no return. The thing was, he wasn't stable. He was the opposite of stable. He was a man whose body was telling her a story in a language she understood perfectly, and she'd just been ordered to stop listening. She set the phone down. She looked at the closed ICU door. She looked back at room 312, where the man who'd brought her son home alive was slowly running out of oxygen. Then she made a decision that would echo through every corridor in Cedar Creek Medical, a decision that would reach the ears of generals and federal prosecutors and the kind of men who operated in spaces that didn't officially exist on any map. She walked back to room 312, positioned herself where she could see every monitor reading, every subtle change in Chen's vital signs, and she began to wait for the moment when her hands would have to move faster than her career could survive. The night had hours left. The monitor beeped steadily, each pulse a countdown. And Katie Rodriguez, the nurse everyone had underestimated, the woman with a folded flag hidden in a locker, the soldier who'd been ordered to stop watching the man she was sworn to protect, simply stood there in the fluorescent light and prepared for war. At 2:16 a.m., the monitor in room 312 screamed. Katie was there in 3 seconds. She didn't run. Running meant panic, meant the kind of visible urgency that would trigger Dr. Mercer's attention. She moved with the controlled precision of someone who had walked into worse things than a flat line, her stride purposeful and economical, her face already reading the room before her hands reached the bed rail. Captain Chen's oxygen saturation was 82 and plummeting. His chest rose only on the right side, the left side silent and still, his face shifting from pink to dusky blue in the space of a heartbeat. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, but the air wasn't getting anywhere. His trachea had shifted visibly to the right, textbook tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in his chest cavity, pressure building with each breath, collapsing his lung, pushing his heart toward arrest. He had maybe 90 seconds before cardiac collapse. Katie hit the code button without looking, her eyes already assessing the equipment drawer. She moved like someone who had done this in sandstorms under enemy fire, like the hospital was a field tent and the clock was counting down to something worse than just death. Muscle memory took over, her hands pulling on nitrile gloves with a snap that sounded like a rifle bolt, her fingers already finding the needle decompression kit, the 14-gauge catheter, the prep solutions arranged in the exact sequence her body had learned 15 years ago in a place that didn't officially exist. "I've got this," she said to the charge nurse who had appeared in the doorway, her voice low and absolutely steady, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. She didn't wait for a response because it wasn't a request. It was a command. Chen's saturation hit 78%. His lips were gray. His eyes were open but unfocused, his brain starving for oxygen, his body recognizing the descent toward death even if his mind couldn't articulate it. Katie swabbed the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, with betadine, the antiseptic smell sharp and chemical in the recycled hospital air. She positioned the catheter with both hands steady as surgical lasers, identified the space between his ribs with the precision that came from anatomy memorized in blood and training, and moved. The resistance gave way. The hiss of released pressure filled the room, trapped air escaping, pressure equalizing, the lung re-expanding. It was the sound of a life switching directions. Chen's chest expanded symmetrically now, both sides rising together, his body remembering how to breathe. His color shifted from gray to something almost human, pink spreading across his face like a sunrise. The monitor showed his oxygen saturation climbing in real time, 81%, 86%, 91%, 94%. His breathing normalized. His eyes focused, found hers, and in that moment he mouthed a single word. "Valkyrie." She didn't respond. Couldn't. The charge nurse had called the code team and they were already moving down the hallway, shoes clicking on tile, the organized chaos of a response team mobilizing. Katie stepped back from the bed, her hand still gloved, the catheter secured and stable, the immediate crisis already transitioning from emergency to management. Captain Chen was breathing on his own now, his color stable, his vitals trending toward something resembling normal. By the time the code team arrived at 2:51 a.m., the crisis was already becoming history. But Dr. Mercer arrived at 3:10. Still in street clothes, slacks and a pressed shirt, his tie already loosened, he appeared in the doorway like someone who had been called away from something important. His eyes took in the scene with the calculating speed of a man trained to assess threats, and Katie watched something cold and precise move across his face. He looked at the decompression catheter in place between Chen's ribs. He looked at the monitor displaying stable vitals. He looked at Katie standing beside the bed with the composure of someone who had just stopped a man from dying, and his jaw tightened so minutely that only someone trained to read micro-expressions would have noticed. "Who authorized this procedure?" His voice was even, clinical, but underneath it was something else, something that sounded like calculation. Katie met his eyes. She didn't blink. She didn't step back. It was emergent. Tension pneumothorax. O2 sat was bottoming out. He would have arrested in under 2 minutes. Mercer stepped closer, his presence filling the room like a pressure change. "You performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization. You didn't wait for the code team. You didn't attempt to contact me." He paused, letting the implication settle into the air like smoke. "That's not heroism, Rodriguez. That's grounds for immediate termination and possible review by the State Medical Board." The other nurses had stopped in the hallway, their conversations dropping to whispers. A respiratory therapist pretended to check equipment nearby but wasn't moving. The code team froze mid-step, reading the temperature shift in the room, understanding suddenly that the emergency was over but something else was beginning. "He was dying," Katie said. Her voice hadn't changed. Her posture hadn't changed. She was still standing with the kind of calm that comes from understanding that some things matter more than consequences. Mercer smiled. It was the smile of a man who had just found a weapon he'd been looking for. "Exactly. You acted without authorization. That's a violation of hospital protocol, state regulations, and your employment agreement." He was already pulling out his phone. "I'm calling administration. Now. We'll let them decide whether your unauthorized heroics warrant immediate termination or just a criminal investigation." He walked out of the room before Katie could respond, her silence chasing him down the hallway like a ghost. The code team didn't stay long after that. The immediate crisis had passed, vital signs stable, breathing normal, the emergency now transitioned from life or death to standard post-crisis monitoring. By 3:36 a.m., the hallway had emptied, the nurses returning to their stations with careful not looking, the incident already spreading through Cedar Creek Medical like electricity through copper wire. The story would change with each telling, Katie performing unauthorized surgery, Katie operating without a doctor's order, Katie deciding she knew better than the attending physician. Only Captain Chen watched her, his eyes tracking her movement around his room as she checked his lines and adjusted his his expression unreadable but his hand reaching out once to touch her sleeve. She didn't acknowledge it. She couldn't. Not in the hallway where the cameras could see. Not where Mercer had already begun his work. The administrative office opened at 7 a.m., but security arrived at 4:45. 2 men in dark uniforms with the apologetic expressions of people doing work they'd rather not do. They walked Katie to HR without speaking, their presence a formality that transformed her from employee to subject. The administrative director was already at his desk. Katie had seen him once before during orientation, a man with tired eyes and the resigned expression of someone who processed terminations the way a factory processed parts. "I'm very sorry about this," he said, and he might have meant it. "The documentation shows a clear pattern of protocol violations." Dr. Mercer provided detailed incident reports. The unauthorized procedure last night was the final incident. He slid a folder across the desk. "Your termination is effective immediately. You'll need to surrender your badge. We'll need your hospital credential returned within 24 hours. Katie didn't open the folder. She'd already read the reports. Mercer's handwriting was precise and clinical, his documentation perfect, his accusations carefully constructed to look like concern for patient safety rather than what they actually were. Strategic elimination dressed up as protocol enforcement. "I saved his life," she said quietly. The administrator met her eyes briefly, then looked away. "I understand. But our procedures exist for a reason. I'm sure you'll find other opportunities." The word "other" hung in the air like poison gas. There would be no other opportunities. Not after this. Not with a termination for unauthorized procedures on your record. Not in a profession where your reputation was everything and the rumor mill worked faster than light. Mercer had been surgically precise, not just removing her from the hospital, but removing her from the profession itself. By 5:15 a.m., Katie's badge had been deactivated. The lock on her locker had been cut open and her belongings packed into a cardboard box by a security guard who wouldn't meet her eyes. 2 uniforms and a box of her life, held at arm's length like something contaminated. She carried it down the hallway she had walked for 2 years, the ICU stretching before her like a tunnel, every station suddenly foreign, every nurse suddenly looking past her or away from her or down at their charts with the intensity of people pretending invisibility. Only room 312 registered as she passed. Captain Chen was awake, his eyes following her. She didn't stop. She didn't look back. The folded flag that had been hidden in her locker since 2009 was visible on top of the box now, faded Delta Force colors, 3 decades of history wrapped into fabric, a fallen soldier's final journey compressed into origami that she'd carried everywhere for 15 years without ever being allowed to explain it. At 3:20 a.m., Katie sat alone in an all-night diner 3 blocks from Cedar Creek Medical. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago. The waitress had stopped asking if she needed anything. The breakfast crowd wouldn't arrive for another 3 hours, leaving Katie in the particular silence of the very early morning, the dead hours when the city held its breath and even the fluorescent light seemed to dim out of respect for the darkness. She stared at the folded flag on the table beside the untouched coffee. It had been wrapped in plastic at the bottom of her locker since the day she was officially erased from service records, a classified casualty of a classified operation that she had been forbidden to discuss, forbidden to defend, forbidden to even acknowledge existed. The flag of Sergeant Michael Chen, Captain Chen's older brother, the man who had died holding a perimeter in Ramadi while Katie was carried out on a stretcher with shrapnel in her chest and 3 bullets across her plate carrier. The reflection in the window showed a woman she barely recognized anymore. Hollow-eyed. 38 years old but looking closer to 60, her face worn by the weight of all the years she couldn't talk about, all the medals she couldn't wear, all the service she had rendered invisible. Someone who had saved 17 soldiers under fire. Someone who had been stripped of rank and identity and buried in civilian life for national security reasons that had expired 5 years ago but nobody had bothered to tell her. Someone who had just saved a life and lost everything for it. She picked up the flag and held it, her hands absolutely steady even as something in her chest came loose like a hinge rusting through. 24 hours later, Katie returned to Cedar Creek Medical to collect her final check. The lobby at 2 p.m. was wrong. All wrong. She entered through the main doors and the first thing she registered wasn't the people, it was the uniforms. Army greens, marine dress blues, the particular cut of military bearing that changed the air pressure in a room. Officers clustered near the administrative wing, a dozen of them at least, their faces grim and purposeful, their presence radiating the kind of official authority that made hospital staff flatten themselves against walls. Katie tried to angle toward the HR office, head down, her civilian jacket collar up, trying to be the kind of invisible that had kept her alive for 15 years. But the universe had other plans. Captain Rodriguez. She froze. The word had landed behind her like a bullet, precise and impossible. Nobody called her captain. Nobody at Cedar Creek Medical knew to call her that. She had spent 2 years being Rodriguez the night shift nurse, Rodriguez the one with the steady hands, Rodriguez the woman with the classification badge that proved she'd signed an NDA about something that couldn't be discussed. When she turned, Captain James Cheng was there. He was pale still, his chest bandaged under a hospital gown, pushed in a wheelchair by a Marine colonel with salt and pepper hair and eyes like flint. Chen's right arm was still IV-strapped, but his left hand reached out, reaching for her, and when their eyes locked he mouthed the word again. Valkyrie. The lobby shifted. Conversation stopped. Staff members turned. A group of nurses near the information desk realized simultaneously that something official was happening, something beyond the scope of hospital protocol, something that meant being witnesses to something they didn't have clearance for. Dr. Mercer appeared from the administrative hallway, confusion cycling toward alarm when he saw the uniforms. What is this? What's happening here? Who are these people? The Marine colonel, Colonel Marcus Webb, according to the name tape on his dress blues, stepped forward with a document held with the formality of a priest holding scripture. His voice carried across the lobby with the particular cadence of someone accustomed to being heard. Colonel Marcus Webb, United States Marine Corps. I'm here regarding Captain Katie Rodriguez, United States Army Medical Corps. He looked directly at Katie. August 14, 2009. Ramadi, Iraq. Forward operating base Hammer. Do you remember? Katie couldn't speak. The words existed in her throat but her vocal cords had locked down, a survival response from someone who had been forbidden to speak about this for so long that remembering felt like treason. Webb continued, reading from his citation with the weight of official record. When insurgent forces overran FOB Hammer, Captain Rodriguez established a defensive perimeter alone while treating 17 wounded soldiers under continuous fire for 42 minutes. She returned fire from a prone position between administering blood products and tourniquets. Her actions directly preserved the lives of all 17 casualties awaiting extraction. A second officer stepped forward, Army Major, younger, intense, the kind of bearing that came from classified work. Silver Star for extraordinary heroism. Bronze Star with V device for Valor in combat. 2 Purple Hearts. All decorations certified and classified under Operation Copper June until declassification last month by Pentagon order. The crowd in the lobby had swelled. Nurses Katie had worked beside for 2 years stood frozen, their minds trying to reconcile the invisible night shift nurse with the woman being described in the language of military heroism. Dr. Mercer's face had gone the color of old concrete. A Navy commander with medical insignia stepped forward. His voice was calm, almost conversational. Code name Valkyrie. Given by the Rangers she saved that day. Captain Rodriguez held that perimeter for 42 minutes under sustained enemy fire. She refused extraction until the last soldier was loaded on the medevac bird. Captain Chen's voice cut through the silence, still rough but clear. I was Lieutenant Chen then. She carried me 30 meters under fire with a femoral artery wound. Held pressure on my leg while returning fire over my body. Dragged me to the extraction point. I wouldn't exist if she didn't exist. The general appeared. 2 stars gleaming on his shoulders, his uniform pressed like knives, his face carved from something older than granite. General Richard Hawthorne, U.S. Army Medical Command, and the lobby went completely silent the moment people recognized the rank. He walked straight to Katie and stopped. His salute was formal and absolute, his fist striking his chest in the gesture of respect that transcended all rank and procedure. Captain Rodriguez, he said, and the words landed like ordnance. You were ordered to assume civilian identity after Operation Copper June was classified. You were officially erased from service records. You were forbidden to disclose your military service, forbidden to defend yourself, forbidden to be anything but invisible. For 15 years, you honored that order despite the cost. He turned slightly, his eye sweeping the lobby, landing on Dr. Mercer with the particular weight of authority about to descend like justice. She was forbidden, the general continued quietly, to be anything but what you treated as disposable. A Pentagon liaison in civilian clothes stepped forward with a tablet. Captain Rodriguez's service record has been unsealed as of 0900 today. All classification restrictions lifted. All restrictions on disclosure terminated. Her full identity is restored to official record. Dr. Mercer's voice cracked when he tried to speak. This doesn't change anything. She violated hospital policy. She performed an unauthorized procedure. General Hawthorne turned toward him slowly. The general didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Dr. Mercer, you've been served with a federal warrant for investigation of healthcare fraud, kickback schemes, and falsification of medical records. Federal agents will be arriving within the hour. You'll need to surrender your hospital credentials and your medical license. Your cooperation would be appreciated. The silence that followed was the silence of a world realigning itself. Katie stood motionless in the center of the lobby, surrounded by uniforms and authority and a general of the United States Army Medical Command, her face showing nothing but her eyes bright with something that might have been tears or might have been something fiercer, something harder to name. Captain James Chen reached out from his wheelchair and took her hand. Within 1 hour of the successful life-saving procedure, while Captain Chen's oxygen saturation climbed back toward normal and his chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, Dr. Mercer stood in the administrative office with his phone pressed against his ear. His voice was low, controlled, the voice of a man whose entire empire depended on this call going exactly the way he'd planned it. He spoke for 3 minutes. Then he hung up. By 3:27 a.m., the ICU charge nurse received an email reassigning her to the pediatric unit, effective immediately. By 3:52 a.m., a second email restricted Katie's access to the hospital information system, citing unauthorized procedure requiring investigation. By 4:15 a.m., the security guards arrived. Katie saw them before they saw her. 2 guards, moving with the purposeful stride of men with a job to complete, their radios crackling static into the pre-dawn darkness. She was finishing a chart at the nursing station, her hand steady, her face showing nothing. The night nurse next to her, Sarah, suddenly found something very important to do 3 units away. Katie didn't blink. She'd read the email about the access restriction. She knew what was coming. She'd known the moment Dr. Mercer's face went cold above Captain Chen's recovering body. Katie Rodriguez. The first guard, older, his name tag reading Patterson, spoke with the careful politeness of someone following a script he'd been given by administration. "That's me," Katie said. She saved her work. Closed the charting window. Stood slowly, giving no one a reason to think she was surprised or frightened or anything other than exactly what she appeared to be, a nurse who'd done her job and was ready to move on. "We need to escort you to your locker," Patterson said. Not a request. Not quite an order either, but something in between. The institutional language of a place protecting itself. The locker room was silent at 4:23 a.m. Katie opened her locker. She could have done it without the key, could have opened anything in this building with her eyes closed, and began removing her things. A cardigan she kept for cold shifts. A family photo she'd hidden in the back, her son Michael at his high school graduation, grinning like he'd just conquered the world. An extra pair of compression socks. The locker had contained the small artifacts of 14 years at Cedar Creek Medical. It took 4 minutes to reduce it to a cardboard box one of the guards provided. Her ID badge was deactivated without ceremony. The guard swiped it at the entrance and it flashed red. Denied. That single color, the harsh red of refusal, carried more weight than any firing letter could manage. Katie took the badge off, set it on the guard's desk, and walked toward the exit. The pre-dawn air hit her face like a cold hand. The parking lot was empty except for a few night shift cars and the security vehicle waiting to ensure she actually left. Katie stood in the darkness for a moment, the cardboard box balanced against her chest. Her scrubs were still on, still marked with the dust and exhaustion of a 14-hour shift. Her hand still carried the faint smell of antiseptic and Captain Chen's blood, now drying brown under her fingernails. She set the box in her car and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. 4:31 a.m. The sky was still dark. The city around Cedar Creek Medical was still asleep. Katie reached into the small pocket of her scrubs and felt the edge of the folded flag there, the fabric so old it had gone soft as tissue paper, the fold creases permanent as scars. She'd carried it for 15 years. It had survived 3 deployments, 2 marriage failures, countless sleepless nights in hospital break rooms, humiliation she never showed anyone. It had survived her carefully constructed life as just a nurse. Now it felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Katie drove to an all-night diner on Capitol Hill, the kind of place where insomniacs and night shift workers gathered to drink coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since 1987. She ordered black coffee and sat in a booth near the window, watching Denver's skyline begin its slow transition from black to gray to the pale orange of approaching dawn. The flag remained in her pocket. The cardboard box sat on the seat across from her, a physical monument to erasure. At 5:17 a.m., her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, Captain Rodriguez. "I'm Captain Chen. I want you to know I'm alive because of you. I know what they said about you, what they did. I'm calling my commanding officer. This isn't over. Chen." Katie read the message 3 times. She didn't respond. Not yet. Not until she understood what "not over" actually meant. 24 hours later, almost to the minute, Katie walked back into Cedar Creek Medical to collect her final paycheck. The lobby was crowded in a way she'd never seen it, uniforms everywhere, the precise dress blues and Class A jackets of the United States Army Medical Corps. She recognized the insignia on several shoulders, officer ranks high enough to make the air feel thicker. Katie slowed her pace, suddenly aware of her wrinkled clothes, the cardboard box still in her hands like evidence. Then Captain Chen appeared in a wheelchair at the far end of the lobby, his chest wrapped in bandages beneath a casual t-shirt, and when he saw her his hand lifted in a gesture that made everyone turn. Katie stopped moving. The lobby went quiet in that way crowds do when something important is about to happen, that particular silence where even the fluorescent lights seemed to hold their breath. Chen's voice was soft but every word traveled. Valkyrie. One word. Just her call sign from 15 years ago, from Ramadi, from a mission that officially never happened. It cut through the lobby like a blade through silk, and Katie felt something in her chest shift, not break, never break, but shift like tectonic plates realigning. A Marine colonel in dress uniform stepped forward, holding a leather folder. His bearing was the kind that came from carrying authority like oxygen, so natural to him he barely seemed to notice he was doing it. Captain Katie Rodriguez, Army Ranger Medical Corps, we are here at the direction of General Patricia Hawthorne, United States Army Medical Command, to read a citation of valor pertaining to classified operations conducted in Ramadi, Iraq, between October 2009 and December 2009. The colonel opened the folder. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of official record. Under Operation Bright Tide, then Second Lieutenant Rodriguez coordinated emergency medical response for a downed medevac helicopter in hostile territory. Despite active fire from enemy positions, she provided emergency medical treatment to 17 wounded soldiers, administered field triage that saved 6 lives that were classified as expectant, and guided 2 separate extraction operations under direct enemy engagement. Her actions under fire resulted in 0 friendly casualties during extraction and recovery operations. For these actions, Katie Rodriguez is hereby recognized as recipient of the Silver Star, with distinction. 2 Purple Hearts, same operation. The Department of Defense and the Army Ranger Regiment recognize and restore full honor status. Dr. Mercer pushed through the crowd, his face flushed, his voice rising. This is insane. You can't just, she performed an unauthorized procedure, she violated protocol, General Patricia Hawthorne turned toward him with the slow, deliberate movement of an avalanche beginning its inevitable descent. She was tall, her uniform immaculate, her eyes the color of cold slate. When she spoke, her voice wasn't loud, but it made everyone lean closer to listen. You terminated Captain Rodriguez for saving Captain Chen's life with a needle decompression. A procedure she's performed successfully 47 times in combat conditions. A procedure that took 90 seconds and prevented cardiac arrest. There were protocols, Mercer started. Your protocols would have killed him, a Pentagon liaison said quietly, stepping forward with a tablet. He was younger, with the careful precision of someone who worked in offices where every word was recorded. Captain Rodriguez identified and treated a tension pneumothorax with precision that comes from saving lives while people are actively shooting at you, doctor. She didn't violate protocol. She overrode bad protocol with better judgment. Mercer's face went very still. The liaison continued, reading from his screen, "You launched an investigation into Captain Rodriguez to justify her termination. That investigation was flagged by the Defense Health Agency due to her classified status. All hospital records were forwarded to federal auditors. They found systematic billing fraud across 43 patients over 36 months. Phantom supply charges totaling $340,000. Kickback arrangements with Hartwell Medical Supply Company, whose CEO is your brother-in-law. Insurance fraud. Medicare fraud. Medicaid fraud." The words fell into the lobby like stones into still water, each one creating ripples that spread outward through the crowd. Katie watched Mercer's face cycle through shock, anger, desperation. She watched the hospital administrator appear in the doorway, his skin the color of ash. She watched the security guards materializing, already knowing what they'd been called to do. "Dr. Mercer, you are suspended effective immediately," the administrator said quietly. "Security will escort you from the building." Mercer's control snapped like a cheap watch spring. She was asking questions. Looking at records that weren't her concern. "I had to protect," he stopped, but the words were already loose, already spreading through the lobby like poison through water. Colonel Webb's smile was cold, surgical. "You had to protect your fraud scheme. So you fabricated disciplinary issues. Falsified medication errors. Isolated her from witnesses. Terminated her the moment she saved a life, because federal oversight of a military patient would have exposed everything." The administrator took Mercer's badge. 2 guards took his arms, their grip professional, their faces neutral. Mercer looked at Katie across the lobby, and in that moment his mask fell completely. She saw a man who'd believed his position was armor, who'd confused institutional power with actual strength, who'd never considered that the quiet nurse asking uncomfortable questions might be someone who'd survived things that would have shattered most people into pieces. Katie's voice, when she finally spoke, was soft. "I did follow orders, doctor. For 15 years I stayed quiet. I never stopped being what I am. You mistook silence for weakness. That was your first mistake. Your second was thinking you could make me choose between saving a life and protecting myself." She paused, let the words settle. "I didn't choose. I just did both." The security guards escorted Mercer toward the exit. The same path Katie had walked 24 hours earlier, badge deactivated, belongings in a cardboard box. But where the staff had avoided her eyes, now they watched Mercer with open contempt. The doors closed behind him. For a moment, the lobby was absolutely silent, even the fluorescent lights seemed to have stopped humming. General Hawthorne turned back to Katie. "Captain Rodriguez, you've been on inactive reserve for 15 years. I'm here to offer you a position, Chief Medical Liaison for Veteran Transition Services, Denver Regional Medical Command. Full rank restoration. Full benefits. Full recognition of your service record. You'd be coordinating care for veterans in civilian hospitals, training staff, ensuring no one falls through cracks like you did." Katie looked at Chen, at the gathered officers, at the nurses who wouldn't sit with her in the break room yesterday and now couldn't look away. "I need to think about it, sir." Her hand, still holding the cardboard box, had stopped shaking. Some part of her that she'd carefully locked away for 15 years had finally been released. Not yet free, maybe, that would take time. But released? The general nodded. "Take your time, Captain. You've more than earned it. If you're enjoying this, please hit like and subscribe, it really helps the channel. And leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from.